Thank you. This is really a kind of a second home for me because of my many friends here. I want to follow in the footsteps of Professor Ivy this morning and channel my remarks into how the topic that he emphasized would fit into contemporary philosophy and its categories. There exists in Western philosophy, England and America primarily, since the last century, an issue called the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy claims that one cannot draw any idea about what is good, what should be, or what ought to be from facts about the world. In other words, that the realm of value having to do with what ought to be, what should be, what is good, it's totally in a different realm from the objective, factual world. The most prominent proponent of this position was the British philosopher G.E. Moore, who wrote a major tome called Principia Ethica. So the terms in which Professor Ivy's remarks fit are this. What he did was to go beyond Shanghai and say, what can we do? What can we do? In ethics, this trend emerges as the difference between not just what can we do, but what ought we to do. Those are the two zones of facts and values that have been dislocated in Western, British, and American philosophy for 100 years. What I aim to do is to follow in Professor Ivy's footsteps and talk about how one can bridge the gap between can and ought. I want to say that those are the categories in which Western philosophers are going to put the discussion about what Professor Ivy talked about this morning. How do we get from can to ought? Well, one thing that you have to do is to figure out whether are there facts that can justify a certain action as good. In other words, you have to give reasons why certain facts are morally relevant. Not all facts are morally relevant, but some facts are. And these are facts that pertain to what we can do. Let me begin by just mentioning two values, and I'm going to try to show you what facts can make it our obligation, our ought to do to achieve those values that we can achieve. All right, the first value is health and human well-being, or the individual's well-being. That, I think, generally would find acceptance fairly universally as an individual and community value. Health and well-being. The second value is social bonding. We know that social bonding is important, among other things, most recently when it was found that the during the last communist regime in Romania, orphans were institutionalized with no loving caregivers, and almost inevitably they all turned out to have serious mental diseases as a result. So humans without social bonding of some kind become mentally very unhealthy. So the facts, now I turn to the realm of facts rather than those two values. The first set of facts is a part of Xuanmeng's idea of interality, which is that change occurs and there are openings. That produces an optimistic view of the possibilities of change. Another set of facts is that there are blockages. Many of the blockages to change in relationships were mentioned by Professor Ivy this morning. Racial, economic, etc. Divisions. But there are steps that we ought to take because of those abilities for change that we know is part of interality and the facts of the blockages. We have an ought, an obligation to bring about the changes, but we have to find out what are the morally relevant facts. The morally relevant facts are that through the formation of partnerships of various kinds, human beings flourish. They flourish not only in terms of their health, but also in terms of their creativity. And for the biologists, they flourish in terms of reproductive ability. This is true not just of human beings, but also of our related mammalian friends, chimpanzees. Chimpanzees used to be kept in cages as single individuals. This was consistent with the teaching of B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, for many, many decades. And I took a course from him when I was in college, and this is exactly the kind of thing that he advocated. If you want to study a chimp, put it in a cage and start feeding it either rewards or punishments for certain behavior. Fortunately, that has changed, and if people want to study chimps now, they know that in order to get them to flourish, they need to be put into group settings, similar to those in the jungle. So the primatologist Frans de Waal, whose recent book is Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? He and his colleagues in the United States and in the Netherlands established jungle-like settings and study the chimpanzees where they can make those partnerships and become members of teams and groups. It was probably only a year ago I read a report by someone who said that at the university in this country where he had been, they study macaque monkeys by putting them in cages and depriving them of any fellow mammal presence ever. That is consistent with the old behavioristic notion. It ignores the fact that macaque monkeys and chimps and we need social bonding in order to flourish It affects, again, our reproductive capacity. And Frans de Waal found one wonderful thing about that, about forming of teams when you're in the group setting. In the Netherlands, where one of his zoos exists, there's also an administrative building with a restaurant, a cafeteria in it, fairly near the caged part of the long cage for the jungle. The staff came in one morning about a couple of years ago and found that there was food spread all over the cafeteria floor. Plates and dishes moved onto the floor and broken. And in the refrigerators, everything was taken out of the refrigerator and dumped on the floor. They didn't know what had happened, so they went over to the caged-in area where the chimps live, and they found that what 25 chimps had done was to find a giant tree trunk, which no single chimp could lift up. And the 25 of them moved this giant tree over to the fence, climbed over the fence, went into the cafeteria, and helped themselves. You can see what can happen when people bond and get together, all kinds of creative activities. My argument then would be that there are morally relevant facts about human beings' need for certain kinds of bonding and certain kinds of partnerships that make it conducive to the values of health and well-being and to the value that we place on some form of human bonding. I think that's enough for me to say about that. If there is no comment, I'll just move on to the speakers of today. So the first speaker today is going to be Stephen Rowe. And his talk is going to be Relatedness and Locus of Awakening.
Thank you. I think the thing I want to pick up on is the idea from later this morning about paradigm shift. It seems to me that we're living in a time of Aufgeheben. A time when an old structure is breaking down and a new structure is struggling to be present. I'm playing around in a very amateur sort of way with tectonic plates, and I've got some metaphor going about we're living in a time of crash, not just Huntington's clash, but actual crash between tectonic plates. And in the best scenario, it seems to me that the modern, which among other things effectively prohibited human bonding or relationality or interality in its obsession with materiality, mechanics, abstraction, etc. The modern worldview, as is broadly understood, that is, I think, in the process of going under. While there's a new worldview that is more or less describable, is ascending. And that part of our job in this era is to articulate for ourselves and our children and our students this new understanding, which is extraordinarily difficult. Existentially, not so much intellectually, but existentially. And it's part of the reason for that is that it is oriented to human development. In other words, there's a new order of humanity that is struggling to emerge with and as this new worldview. And the new worldview, as a sort of corollary to human development, is fundamentally pluralistic. Not relativistic, but pluralistic. I think one of the most important distinctions of our era is between pluralism and relativism. And children of the West who are schooled in abstraction and formulation and dogma, doctrine, hierarchy, patriarchy, authority, etc., once that disappears, a certain mood of which is initially kind of good, school's out, anything goes, that sort of transitions into relativism as things deconstruct into low common denominators of consumption and interest and power, and then from there it's a short stroll into nihilism, and from there into terrorism. Nietzsche, at the end of Genealogy of Morals, said, I think one of the most profound things of our era, mankind would rather will the void than be void of will. So with this general collapse of traditional culture, there are all kinds of dangers associated with relativism, reactions against relativism into cults, fascism, ideological orientations of all sorts. I mean, the intellect is where so many Western people feel comfort. So under the stress of relativism and the absence of traditional absolutism, many of them tend to look for or create or find a kind of absolutism. And that is dangerous. So alongside the dangers of absolutisms, we have the dangers of modernism passing and a good deal of anger associated with that. Worldviews don't generally exit the stage of history gracefully. There's a good deal of resentment and anger toward this new orientation, the ultimate form of which, it seems to me, is terrorism. The kind of radical, if we can't control it, let's just at least tear it down. So, in broadest terms, it seems to me, what's the Chinese curse? That you should be alive in interesting times. We're alive in extraordinarily interesting times, and the dangers run very, very high. And I would propose that interality is one of the major metaphors, or I really like Emily Dickinson. In the process of preparing for this event, I made a new friend in Emily Dickinson. And if I can get the book back from Lehigh, I will read some more tonight. But I want to cite in particular her point, her 1129. This is around in this new worldview. I mean, there are lots of, Parker Palmer quotes this. Several other people quote this same stanza, so it isn't my sheer genius that caused me to find this. Tell the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. The truth, or that which is ultimate in life, is radically ineffable. Shanghai refers to Lao Tzu. First line, Tao Te Ching. The truth that can be told is not the truth. The Tao that can be known is not the Tao. Pointing to this peculiar human condition where most of us experience something of ultimacy in life, and in order to even remember an experience, I've got to tell myself some kind of story, if not develop some kind of a symbol. But the minute I do that, I'm in danger of that human problem that in the West we refer to as idolatry, worshiping the symbol rather than that to which it points. I mean, this is one of the most systematic human tendencies, I think, that we have, and not only in the West. This symbol, as the theologian Paul Tillich said, is ideal because it's transparent to the ultimate. Well, yeah, but the minute I've got it here, I'm in danger of focusing on, to switch to a Japanese metaphor, focusing on the finger rather than the moon to which it points. I need a finger that points to the moon, but as a human being, I'm endlessly in danger of worshiping the finger rather than that to which it points. So it seems to me that one of the chief agendas for us is human development into more sophisticated human beings. I think Barack Obama was just profoundly correct at just the right moment when he said, we need some more adults in the room. Damn, it's as simple as that, isn't it? Okay, one thing an adult can do, which is very easy to say, not very easy to do, but is to have the hermeneutical sophistication to realize that I need an interpretation, a philosophy, a life orientation, but I need to resist the human temptation to absolutize that. I need to be able to live as a pluralist, not a relativist. And a pluralist, above all, is epistemologically humble to the point of appreciating that other people have angles of vision, as James said, on that which is ultimate, and that by talking with the other who's different, I could learn more, number one. And number two, even more profoundly, I could also put myself in the space, the emptiness between us, the nothingness, in the interality, out of which truth as a dynamic process could appear. So my title, Relatedness as Locus of the Ultimate, is simply an indication of that sense in which I think the best of Western culture, which was largely eclipsed as of Descartes, involves appreciation of this sense in which encounter with the other who's different and who remains different can be my greatest opportunity, not a threat. So all this talk in universities and other places about diversity, inclusion, otherness, alterity, etc., that seems to me points to something that is absolutely vital to our era and very hard to understand and very easy to get confused. I mean, GVSU more or less gets this right, I think. But colleges are, what was it that Whitehead said in Science in the Modern World, I think, great ideas enter history with disgusting alliances, but the greatness remains nerving the race in its slow ascent. Alterity is arguably the great idea of our era, but of course, the minute it appears, it's also immediately surrounded and co-opted, or as my colleague and friend Elizabeth Minnick says, clichéified on all sides. So it's not easy to educate oneself in the appreciation and the way of life that is oriented to interality as living in vital relationship, which is inevitably paradoxical in that it involves elements of both definiteness and openness. I'm no good in any relationship if I'm not definite. That's Proteanness, that's Woody Allen's Zelig effect, that's, one of the great pathologies of our era. The person that really doesn't exist, they just are a chameleon. They take on the shape of the situation they're in and reflect whatever values are present. So I need to avoid the openness as just what Saul Bellow in one of his novels called mashed potato love. I mean, just nothingness. on the one hand, and on the other, definiteness that becomes an ideological weapon. So okay. So I think I'm old enough that I want to tell a little story. I think super short. What time? This is about the emergence of a new worldview. Very quickly. So the college I went to happened to have a meditation center at the top of the hill in the woods. And so in the 60s, as a college student, somehow or other, I found my way to actually Vietnamese Zen Buddhism, and certain people who were in residence in this kind of hidden place. And then a little later in the 60s, I found myself exposed to an amazing emergence or surfacing of the interalogical or relational worldviews. I tend to refer to it in the form of speeches that were given by King, Kennedy, Michael Harrington, Sergeant Shriver. All, amazingly, in 63 or so, they all gave variations on the same speech. Now is the time to make real the promise. That was Martin Luther King's statement of it. But MLK and the others that I mentioned, amazing, this sense of possibility and relational possibility. Possibility specifically of what Don is talking about in terms of human bonding. After a long period of domination of the Cartesian worldview, which among its most basic principles is that relationship is only of extrinsic value in relation to the satisfaction of my interest, not of intrinsic value. Now, I think in the modern period there was a time early on when there were communities of relationship that valued the intrinsic dimension of relationship. I think that's what, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville was talking about when he was so enthusiastic about America, when he came to check this strange experiment out in the 19th century, and he said it's, voluntary associations. And what he meant by that was a kind of bonding around issues of a shared life. And so it wasn't just shared interests, a shared life. But of course, that gets eclipsed in the rush of modernity, etc. I had the great good fortune then, after college, of being involved with the civil rights movement mostly in Chicago, but also the social ethics at the University of Chicago, where this sense of a kind of relationship was something that many people were aware of and were teaching and were articulating. I think it surfaced, that same kind of orientation surfaced again very dramatically in the early 80s with the intercultural dialogue movement. Have been very impressed that John Cobb's book, Beyond Dialogue, appeared just about exactly the same time as Maso Abe's book, Zen and Western Thought. And again, this idea of dialogue is not just about I get to know you, you get to know me, or even we get to know each other and I get to know myself more deeply. It's more radical than that. It's that in those acts, we place ourselves in this interlogical space where we have access to the truth as a vital, or that which is ultimate in life, or the wellspring of life, or whatever the Tao. that somehow or other we are in a space where something becomes available that isn't available by myself or when we're just doing business. This is a way of bonding and taking care of things that is way beyond the simple mechanical exchange of modernity. And just quickly, and I'm going to stop very soon, I think another source of emergence that is very compatible with what we've been talking about is the emergence of the contemplative dimension, especially if you look at the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, Arthur Zajonc and his colleagues in Amherst. They're making a very strong argument with empirical backup that for the past 300 or maybe much longer years in the West, there have been two epistemologies: rationalist, top down, and empiricist, bottom up. But that the contemplative is dropped out altogether. And it's possible to demonstrate, scientifically even, that participation in the contemplative dimension and reclaiming that and developing that as a modern person who has been brought up in an environment of alienation from that is incredibly effective as a way of being in all of its dimensions. Finally, I guess I want to argue that, or point to another one of these slants, to developments in higher education that are, in my mind, most fully articulated by the AAC&U, American Association of Colleges and Universities, I mean, there's a lot of questioning in higher education about, do we really need education? What the heck is liberal education anyway? Who needs it? Except, I mean, there's an enormous amount of questioning, and some of it is just simple-minded anti-intellectualism. But some of it is legitimate questioning of, do we need that education? Meaning the modern education of rote learning, etc. In response to that, it seems to me there is emerging a new orientation that is, I think, most completely articulated from day to day by the AAC&U programs. And in my own work, I suggest that there are three major dimensions to this new orientation to education. Dialogue, in other words, developing the capacity to engage in dialogue. What's his name? Yankelevich, the great pollster, a few years ago wrote a book on dialogue, and he said most Americans aren't capable of dialogue. They're just not developed enough to be able to participate in dialogue. Secondly, mindfulness, meaning sufficient self-transcendence that I'm not constantly being held hostage by my little ego and its ongoing drama. Yeah, that goes on, but in my better moments, I can have some distance and maybe even a laugh once in a while about this life that goes on within me that isn't exactly my authentic life or me at my best. And then third, service or justice, which involves, I think, a recalling or a reclaiming of the interlogical at its fullest that has been expressed in the great traditions with the awareness that the end of meditation is to stop meditating, or the end of meditation is to be meditating all the time, or the greatest meditation is humble service to the other. In which case, in Japanese Zen, prajna is karuna. prajna, wisdom, the ultimate wisdom is love of the other. Compassion is the ultimate practice. Easy to meditate in the monastery, more difficult in the home, most difficult in the world. If you can really do it, you can do it right out there in the middle of the ordinary. I'm a little critical of Japanese Zen schools that, you know, put the master in the bathroom cleaning toilets. I mean, I get the point, okay? The most humble, imaginable activity, that's enlightenment. Well, I want to get a little further, deeper down into where it's really messy, and that is in relationship, in service, in compassion with the other. I could go on about this. I think in terms of Judeo-Christian tradition, this kind of understanding helps me to see that love thy neighbor as thyself is not, which is ordinarily presented as a commandment. Maybe that's not so much a commandment as it is your best advice. If you want to live well, that's what you want to do. And, you know, maybe God likes it, or I don't know exactly where God stands on. Well, I think I do sometimes. But the point of that being a locus of human bonding rather than simply of obedience to command. I'll stop there. We have a third.
Yes. Does anybody have a question right away? Because we'll also have a chance after the last person has spoken. We invite all people with loose tongues. Well, then we'll wait till after the next presentation. Professor Yu. Oh, excuse me. There's a question there. Yes.
I asked Professor Ivy if you knew of any organizations that sort of, the sort of love thy neighbor sort of thing. Do you know of any organizations that sort of run that middle ground between people, you know, in that sort of empty space that facilitate that sort of discussion to allow for that and to teach that, I guess, not necessarily a secular way, but in a way that is inclusive to all people, you know, from whatever spectrum of race, sexuality, political affiliation, whatever. It seems that there's, you know, in our sort of democracy, there's no room to sit on the fence anymore. You have to be on one side or the other. Do you know of anything that allows for that, I guess? Or is there even that possibility at this point?
I think in American culture at this point, the most highly visible answer to that question would probably be Parker Palmer and his rather extensive organization, and he's written many, many books. But if you just Google Parker Palmer, it's one of his books is called Reclaiming the Heart of Democracy. He's all about the kind of simultaneity of individual development and community development, and the fact that they need to, it can't be one without the other. I mentioned the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society, CCMS, and they have several subgroups also. Eric Liu out of Seattle has a number of programs at LIU that I think are responsive to that super important question. And on their best days, most American universities are trying to respond to that too, through service learning or community engagement or civic engagement. I mean, American universities, almost without exception, have got what is variously called those things, you know, civic learning, community engagement, service learning, etc., pretty upfront. And some of the efforts are pretty awkward and strange and not very persuasive, but at least the effort is there.
excuse me, I'll give you another example. There has been a movement for at least 20 years among corporate leadership, CEOs, to evaluate a corporation according to 3 different standards. Before, the only standard was short-term profit, measured quarterly. The new standard is social impact, environmental impact, and corporate governance. Corporate governance meaning, do the shareholders have any say in what the CEO and the trustees decide? These stand equal to profit, short-term profit, so that there are 4 different gauges of profit, of positive behavior. And at shareholder meetings, this topic comes out. And social impact says, what is the impact on a community where the corporation has interests? I think evaluations of the project are mixed. They do pretty well in terms of social impact, not so hot on environmental impact. But that's an example of one zone in the country where that has began to occur. Maybe we better switch to Professor Yu, who will talk about Interalogy and the beginning of philosophy. He is from the Shanghai Yuan in Shanghai.
I'm very glad to be here. And, the term interality and interalogy very difficult to pronounce. Are new terms for me also. I cannot find in dictionary. There will be a time we can find in dictionary the 2 terms. I think I have the confidence that with so many people discuss these 2 terms, and you can explain so many meanings, significance of these 2 terms. Actually, Professor Xuanmeng confirmed just now. He said, I am the first one to know these 2 terms because he told me before he told to others. So many years before, maybe 4 or 5 years before, he wrote a paper about Tao. He gives Tao the meaning, slowness. And then later he wrote another paper in English, talking about interality. So I urged him to translate into Chinese and publish in China. But still, it's a surprise for me today. So many people, they talk about these terms in different areas. I can see the influence of these terms. But today I think I should recall the background why somebody put these terms. In this morning he himself told us about the history, about the story, how he mentioned interality term. Actually, his background is a comparative study. between the Chinese philosophy and the Western philosophy. The Western philosophy cannot explain the Chinese philosophy. This is the problem. But at these circumstances, the Chinese philosophy, whether Chinese philosophy is philosophy, this is a problem. By the beginning of this century, in China, there is also a saying, the so-called the legitimacy of the Chinese philosophy. So why, at the beginning of this century, we have such suspicion? We know shortly after the Western philosophy comes to China, scholars began to write the history of Chinese philosophy. People believe that, sure, we have philosophy. So no one suspects whether we have we have or not have philosophy in China. People think, yes, we have. So people began to write this book. I think you know Hu She, one of the earliest. He is not the first one. Another scholar write the Chinese history book before then Hu She. I read this book recently and find that book cannot be taken as the modern philosophy book, because he writes this according to the ancient style. We say in Chinese we say 明儒学案, 宋儒学案, 学案, how to say 学案? He tells the story of those philosophers. Then add some philosophy thinkings, this kind of book. But what is philosophy? This is the key problem. So Hu She, he said, philosophy deals with the issues, the crucial issues of human life. This is his definition of philosophy. I don't think all the Western scholars will accept this definition of philosophy. And then later, Feng Yulan gave the Chinese philosophy, gave the philosophy, the definition of philosophy, and gave a new definition. His philosophy is a reflection of human spirit. I think he followed Hegel. Philosophy should formed by the categories. The categories are the results of the conflection, a reflection of the consciousness or the human reflection of the human spirit. So we should raise higher to the consciousness, to a concept, to a category. So I think in this way, people, the scholars try to follow the Western philosophy when they formulating the Chinese history of philosophy. And it shows later people more and more closely follow the Western philosophy when doing Chinese philosophy. In Hu She's history of Chinese philosophy, we cannot find it's difficult to find the problem, philosophical problem in his book. But in Feng Yulan's book, he said, there is one very important philosophical, the real philosophical problem. It is the relationship between universality and particularity. So he tried to find in the history of Chinese, in Chinese history, the problems dealing concerning with the relationship between the two. If we have a deep analysis of his saying, we can find that this imitation is wrong, because what he means by the relationship between particularity and universality is usually we say 体用. In Chinese we say 体用. 体 that means substance. 用 maybe a function. So substance and the function. He said this kind of saying is the relationship between universality and particularity. Of course, I think this wrong. It's wrong because it's changes the real meaning of the Chinese philosophy. Except Qi and Yung, he also has another find another saying. He said, 理智 reason maybe principle
Principle.
yeah,
Some people
principle
say principle,
气
energy,
energy
Qi, yeah, energy.
spirit,
Energy.
also 道气 vessel 气 道 and 气 this kind of relationship in formula it means this is a relation between particular and universal. If this saying cannot be stand, then the whole book, he looked at the 7 volumes of new edition, altogether 7 volumes. He said this is the real philosophical problem from ancient to modern times, from China to foreign countries. So actually, I think the Chinese philosophy, in Chinese history, we cannot find such a kind of relationship. We never entering into the universality, universal. Because this morning I discussed with you. We don't have Plato's idea real. Only in idea real, then we have such kind of universality. People easily to mix with universal with general.
Can we make this a discussion? You permit me to make some comments right now?
Yes.
Okay? Because this is
Yeah,
a
yeah,
discussion style.
Yes.
Okay? It seems to me a time to point out that there is a basic assumption starting in early Chinese philosophy that is not shared in Western philosophy. In Western philosophy, starting with the Greeks, there's a pure division between mind and body. And what goes along with that is a differentiation between reasoning on the one hand and sense experience on the other, with sense experience being viewed as inferior to reasoning. That division doesn't exist in early China, where the mind and body are conceived with the same terminology. So dualism, which is a
Different kinds of dualism.
yeah, totally different. They're not different. They're not dualisms of substance, but of different kinds of energy. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
So, so after so many years following the Western philosophy to write the history of Chinese book, people suddenly aware that it's wrong. We cannot follow the Western history to write the Chinese history. So the suspicion rises. The legitimacy of the history of China, the Chinese philosophy. This is the background.
看这个您说这个什么时候开始？When did it start? People become doubt, reflection.
Maybe before this century, people never suspect whether we have philosophy. But by the end of the last century, people worked out the ontology. What does it mean by ontology? I think the Chinese scholar didn't understand ontology for long. They think ontology talks about something like 道、气、理、本、这个体、用。But these are not ontologies. Ontology, as the first principle of the Western philosophy, formulated by the categories to use the logical way to formulate a system. So this kind of things we don't have. So more and more people maybe they accept, yes, we cannot follow the Western philosophy. We are the different types of philosophy. So people begin to suspect.
I just want to make a comment. This is not only philosophy, it's happened to other disciplines. I'm from theater background. We had the same argument that Chinese has no theater. From Aristotle's definition, there's no theater in China.
No theater. No theaters.
戏剧.
Ah.
So it's a very common
Yeah.
the way of thinking. It's westernized.
That's concerning the concept of theater. What does it mean? Does it mean by theater? Whether we have the same concept, same idea of theater in China. So also people say, in China people discuss when they discuss literature, they say the literature of, the ontology of literature. I think you, the Western scholar, don't accept those kind of saying. Ontology of literature, ontology of physics.
No.
So in China, people, ontology is a word wisely used. They don't know the real meaning of this term. So when we have a relatively clear understanding of ontology, we say, no, we don't have such kind of things in China, in Chinese philosophy. Then there comes suspicion. But after this saying comes forth, some people say it's a pseudo problem. They don't want to discuss it. I don't think it's a pseudo problem. We should seriously deal with it, seriously to face it. So how to face it? Xuanmeng is a way. He tried to mention interality, and interality have vast use, even can explain the Western philosophy. And the interality, this term is mainly borrowed from I Ching, you see, the Chinese philosophy. What a powerful, what a useful things. Yes, I think this is, I talk with him frequently. although he is in United States, every year, almost every year, when he come to China,
You are his mentor.
no,
你是他的导师。
they are,
You are his
no,
mentor.
He is my colleague and also the schoolmates.
Okay.
I have several years older than him. We are good friends. And then comes the problem how to deal with such suspicions. But I think if we say so, the Western scholars, whether they would like to accept these results, whether they can accept this point, say, yes, the Chinese philosophy is more deeper than you.
Yes, but since you're looking at me, I'm going to answer. Back to you. Yes, there are the differences, and Interality identifies one right from the beginning. But part of philosophy in the West is a dimension that I think is applicable in China or in any other culture. And it's a methodology that looks at a question. Philosophers always, at least should, begin by asking questions and then trying to answer them. Well, it looks at the answers they give, and the first thing they do is to say, what are the assumptions lying behind this question?
Yeah.
So on the matter of people in China who continue to use the word ontology, you can say, well, what assumption are you making that you use that term? You're already assuming that there is such a thing? Well, if you are, then we come to the second part of the methodology, which is definitions. You must define your terms. And perhaps when they try to define ontology, they'll find that they don't have any definition of it. The third thing is you have to give arguments to justify your position. And if you have made certain assumptions, you have to give arguments to justify those assumptions. I think all of that can be applied as a methodology in the case of Chinese philosophy. On the other side, I think China has lots of positions of its own which we have not examined because we have not adequately examined the assumption that there is a difference between mind and body. Descartes is famous for making the distinction in a very public manner, but what are the arguments that he gave for it? Are they valid? If they're not valid today, then maybe we should stop using a dichotomy like that.
So now we come to the point whether the Western philosophy also accept this saying.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the philosophy is always asks the questions.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of the question is the last question? If we can find the last question,
Mhm.
then the Western philosophy, also both the Western and the Chinese philosophy, this is the last question. It's very difficult. For instance, this morning, Professor Wang, they talk about the process philosophy. And they mean process also one meaning is interbeing.
Mm-hmm.
So it means process is also a being, a kind of being.
Mm-hmm.
So being, whether we can ask further questions about being, If being is the last question, yes, every philosophy begins from being. So you also mentioned every question has assumptions.
Mhm.
So the assumption also a limitation. A limitation.
Sure.
For instance, a natural sciences,
Mhm.
its presupposition is a limitation of this science. If we broke this presupposition, then there is a revolution. And if we broke this limitation, then we go from natural science to philosophy. So
Or to
philo-
quantum mechanics.
Yeah. So what kind of question in philosophy we should broke its limitation? So there is a question, a question raised by Heidegger. Heidegger said, why there is being rather than nothing? If you can ask, you can answer the origin, the cause of being. Everything is being. But still, here we have different understanding. We can understand in being as a category or a concept. We can also understand being in Heidegger's way. Being is not a concept, but is a process. Our consciousness is in this process. In this process, everything is revealed to me. This kind of process is called being. So, being, we can have everything that it is in the process of being. This later, the later being is what he means. So in this sense, this being also calls nothing. But this nothing, if we understand nothing as a concept, nothing is a being. Because nothing is a concept or a category. A category and a concept is not nothing. It is a being.
It's 2:40. Can we have questions for you now? The discussion, or do you have something more?
Nothing.
That's everyone.
Okay.
Okay.
If we go a step further, it comes to the real beginning of the philosophy. The real beginning means here, in this point, there is no separation between subjective and objective. No consciousness and matter. Can we get such kind of situation? It's not words to say this. If I stand outside this situation, then it's being. I am the subject. The story is the object. There is some circumstances, or there is some situation we came inside. By Heidegger's term, this is the event. In the event, the thing goes. You are part of the thing. The environment is part of the thing. The thing goes smoothly, successfully, more successfully, the less we conscious myself as a subject. I mixed with the things. Just like when you drive, you will not say, I'm the subjective, this car is the objective. You under the car are the one, the integral one. And also the highway with you are the integral one. The subjective and the object rise from those situations. This is the real standpoint. Since there is not more time for me to say, I can say in Chinese philosophy from the very beginning, from ancient, try to find and express this very beginning. It's very difficult. From I Ching to Zhongyong, later to Wang Yanming, and they accept the Buddhism ideas. They begin to know how to express this very beginning. And only in this very beginning, I think both the Western philosophy and the Chinese philosophy, yes, this is our common beginning. Then whether it is a philosophy, yes, we can see. Yes.
Could we? We open the floor to comments. We're looking for wisdom. Surely there is wisdom in these pews.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that very much. Going back to what Whitehead says in Adventures of Ideas in part 1, he talks about how within the Oriental or Asian traditions, Eastern traditions, there is not a profound sense of this individual, or when you were talking earlier, the notion of particularity that gets contrasted with universality. This is also said about African cultures, Indian cultures, or primitive civilizations, if you will, what Hegel called the night of the spirit, so to speak. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that in terms of, it seems that even Whitehead, who has this process orientation, still operates with this kind of bias that the Western civilization has a unique perspective on valuing the individual, and therefore it gives it an entitlement with regards to freedom, democracy, and progress, so to speak. So thank you.
Yes, just now I checked with Professor Xuanmeng. We say in Confucius analytic, there is a saying at the very beginning. Isn't it happiness? We have friends from far away. Mm-hmm. What's the significance of this simple sentence put at the beginning of analytic? If we say two people, we both have two tendencies. One is myself, other is no, not only me. I and you are friends. We are the human being together, the human being. But it's possible. If I say this me, I fear of you. You scared of me. So it's very possible when I meet you first time, I will attack you. And also you could attack me. This is possible. But from the very beginning, Confucius maybe also knows this situation. He said, no. Benevolence means two human beings. It's our essence. I use the term essence. Actually, in Chinese philosophy, we don't have the term essence. If the essence of a human being lies in the relationship between others. So he tells us we should advocate benevolence rather than hatred. So I see you. I say, yes, you are my compatriots. You are my friend. We are the same. So we should treat each other friendly, not to treat you as an enemy. It's unsafe for everyone. So Confucius is very great. From very ancient time, he teaches people to live in a correct way, not by individual way. So individual, absolute individual is not good.
Let me add something to that. It seems to me on the western side of the picture, there has been a community orientation, especially through the churches. But long ago, the churches divided into different sects. And one of the problems with the churches is that at least certain denominations of them became very hierarchical. For example, my Scottish ancestors were Calvinists, and they demanded independence of thought with regard to the crown, whoever ran the country. But within the church itself, the preacher was a total boss of what people could think. So another source of the idea about American individualism came from the experience of the people who settled the West. And because of a famous history book written about in the 1890s, individualism was associated with pioneers setting up their own communities. But subsequent studies have found out that wherever the pioneers wanted water, they had immediately to work with other people because you can't dig ditches all by yourself. So there are lots of competing factors. Sorry for butting in, Steve.
I'm just gonna throw on the table 630 of the analects. If you wanna build up yourself, build up the other. I mean, that relationality is very powerful in the analects.
Yeah.
And so part of the point I wanna make is that the Western individualism is in many ways an expression of the intensified mind-body dichotomy and dichotomizing consciousness generally, which is extremely effective in terms of manipulating the world, the natural world, and the world of other people. They are very effective, but not very effective in terms of cultivation of the full human person.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of Faustian deal that was made at some point along the way, and now it's up.
I think I will not deny the economy as a phenomenon, as a necessary phenomenon. Even the dividing of the labor work, dividing of the work. Because if we don't know the source of those divisions, we will go along one division for too long and forget the ultimate aim of all human beings. Why we should do that? We go so far. Because all division is from the one source. What is this source is human beings' life. We divided why we should divide into different divisions. There is a need. There is a need from human being. This is the source. So, what kind of need is correct? It should be solved. And if not, people will go along one division. So people say, that kind of way made the one-dimensional man. Is the thing come from.
That's exactly what Marcuse was pointing to with that term. That phenomenon.
Of course, mammalian societies are hierarchical. It's not necessarily the fact that we need to kowtow. But that's just the way we are. All mammals do that. The question is, are the hierarchies justifiable or not? And I think that's what he was talking about. I mean, the mind-body division in the West helped to support a social division between people who work with their minds, namely scholars and priests, and people who work with their hands, namely skilled tradesmen and peasants. Yes.
Regarding to Professor Bong's question about the quick and the whitehead, we have published a book named Second Enlightenment. Second Enlightenment. We think, we don't agree, totally agree, we go to just go to being, or go to interbeing, or relationship. We think, where there kind of a dichotomy between individualism and the collectivism, like you mentioned, the hierarchy, patriarchy. We have probably found the middle way, kind of transcendent. Okay? Because, I think about the Professor Rowe, your question, I think even, whenever I talk to the people always ask the same question about, something we want to totally deny or throw away being. No, it's not our way. We tell people there are two ways of thinking. One way is simply thinking, substance thinking. Another way is called non-substance thinking, or ritual thinking, right? But I think the two thinking can help you. While you watch things, you can have two angles will help you. That's why in our book, Second Enlightenment, we think about there's still some value in individualism, in the substance idea, because that's independence is good in some way. People need grow up. Need to have a work have strong. But in Chinese culture, sometimes we too rely on other people. We too we like stuck in the relationship. I remember space as room for freedom for developing yourself. That's why we like to come the concept called person in community. I think that's good, kind of transcendent the economy between individualism and the collectivism. I think that's something directly.